Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's talk on the origins of the idea of genocide in the 20th century. It's a privilege and honor to have with us here tonight Professor Carolyn J. of Yale University. This is Professor Dean's first visit to Kolkata. Welcome to Kolkata. And although she was visiting for just a few days, when I proposed the idea of this talk, she readily agreed. So thank you so much. We're very grateful for doing this for us. Professor Carolyn J. Dean is the Charles J. Stille Professor of History and French at Yale University since 2013. Before coming to Yale, she was John Hay Professor of International Studies at Brown University, where she taught from 1991 to 2013. She has also been the recipient of several distinguished fellowships, including an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship, among several others. In 1996, she was awarded Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and the Council for Advancement of Support of Education. Professor Dean is a historian of modern Europe with a focus on the 20th century, whose work explores the intersection of ideas and culture, most recently in the context of genocide. She has also written extensively about gender and sexuality in France and on the intellectual history of French theory. She is currently working on a series of essays on recent narratives about human dignity and atrocity photography, and a larger book-scale project on the history of homophobia since the 19th century in Europe and the United States. We would hope that we will have her back in Kolkata sometime soon to speak on these topics, particularly homophobia, a subject on which we in India need to work a lot. Professor Carolyn Dean has previously written 5 books that focus on the historical and cultural representation of victims, including such recent ones such as Aversion and Erasure, The Fate of the Victim After the Holocaust, which was published in 2010 by Cornell University Press, and The Fragility of Empathy After the Holocaust, also published by Cornell University Press in 2004. Her latest book, titled The Moral Witness, Trials and Testimony After Genocide, which is in the process of coming out from Cornell University Press. It's not yet available on Amazon and on the Cornell University Press for immediate sale. But this book is the first cultural history of the witness to genocide in the West. The book examines how the witness became a protagonist of 20th century moral culture by tracing the emergence of this figure, the witness, in courtroom battles from 1920s to the 1960s, covering the Armenian Genocide, the Ukrainian Pogroms, the Soviet Gulag, and the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. In these trials, witness testimonies differentiated the crime of genocide from war crimes and began to form our understanding of modern political and cultural murder. Her talk tonight tells this fascinating story through 2 of these trials, Berlin in 1921 and Paris in 1927. And that's all I have to say for now. Like all of you, I'm looking forward eagerly to a fascinating lecture on a fascinating topic. So please join me in welcoming Professor Carolyn Dean to speak on Witness Avengers, the Armenian Genocides and Ukrainian Pogroms, Berlin 1921 and Paris 1927. Professor Dean.
Excuse me, thank you for that.
Before we begin, I have a pleasant duty. Just a small souvenir from the tribunal.
It's very heavy.
Sorry, we'll keep it.
Thank you very much. For that, I was not asked to pre-approve the introduction, or surely it would have been much shorter. And I am going to speak today from the forthcoming book, though in a shortened version, about the 2 trials that were mentioned. I want to thank Mr. Professor, I should say, Sengupta, for inviting me, and I want to thank all of you for the honor of coming out tonight to hear the talk, which I hope at least will be interesting. So what I've tried to do is to tell the narratives of these trials and then frame them with the question of the prehistory of genocide. Really, the question is, how did genocide come to mean what it did in the West?
Is it okay with you? Is the light okay with you?
Can
you read or?
It's okay. No, it's all right. I can see. Let me just, is this correct? Let me just make sure. Okay. I'm going to just put it back to the title. Anyway, I'll just start the talk. All right. By telling the story of these two trials, I want to address a historical question. How is genocide given its cultural rather than legal meaning in the West? How were the ravages of genocide distinguished from the mass murder of imperial conquest and from war combat? This is a long story. It's worthy of a book at least, and many more, I'm sure. Suffice it to say that genocide, though a legal term, is slippery from a cultural perspective. It is used evenly now to prosecute perpetrators, more likely to be including in retrospect. When imperial nations, for example, finally acknowledge massive colonial crimes, they have often been called genocides. The story about how genocide was attributed with cultural meaning is thus also a story of how Western publics came to understand, acknowledge, and deny their own violence. And I'm going to speak now on the Tellerian trial in Berlin. In the mid-morning of March 15, 1921, Sogolman Tellerian shot Talat Pasha in an affluent neighborhood in Berlin. Is this very loud? Feels very loud. Oh, Talat, one of the men responsible for planning the 1915 Armenian Genocide, had been one of the highest-ranking officials at the Ottoman court. Talat fled to Berlin after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire to avoid trial by the Allies, that is, the victorious Allies in the Great War of 1914 to 1918, the First World War. But he was targeted for assassination by the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, an important Armenian political party. The plotters in the party assigned the job to Tellerian, whose family had perished in the genocide. The would-be assassin rented a room across the street from the former minister and got to know his routine. Tellerian shot Talat through the back of the head and ran, but he was cornered by bystanders who hailed the police as he protested in halting German that the incident was merely a dispute between foreigners and they should let him go. They didn't. The Armenian shooter was arrested and he was brought to trial a few weeks later on charges of premeditated murder. After a hasty preliminary investigation, the June trial lasted 2 days. This is actually in a museum in Istanbul. It is the bloody shirt of Talat. This is Talat's house, which is now it's just a building in Istanbul. This is not a very nice picture because I took it, but I think it's a gas company or something, but it has a plaque dedicated to Talat as former minister of the Interior. 5 years later in Paris, Samuel Sholem Schwarzbart, a Bessarabian Jewish watchmaker, committed a similar crime of vengeance. He had come to France in 1910 to escape political repression in Russia, fought in the Great War, won the Croix de Guerre in 1916, and acquired French nationality. He returned to Odessa in 1917 to fight with anarchist forces, assisting the Bolsheviks to take over the city. Several years later, back in Paris, Schwarzbart learned that Shimon Petlura, former head of the short-lived Ukrainian National Republic, was living there in exile. And this stamp was issued in 2004. As you can see, like Talat, he is now renewed as a symbol of Ukrainian nationalism. Now, Petlura was living in Paris in exile, and he had been the commander of the Ukrainian army and had allegedly organized the 1917 pogroms that took some 50 to 60,000 Jewish lives and wounded or orphaned many more. He settled in Paris in 1924 as the head of the Ukrainian government in exile, and he published a Ukrainian language newspaper. On May 25, 1926, Schweitzbart shot him 5 times outside of a bistro in the Rue Racine, and a few more times after he was dead. When the police showed up, Schweitzbart proclaimed that he had killed a great butcher, a great assassin. He was arrested and put on trial from 8 days, from October 18th to October 26, 1927, after a pretrial investigation that lasted 17 months. Both Tellerian and Schweitzbart were acquitted of murder after juries heard blood-curdling accounts of the Armenian massacres and the military invasions of Ukrainian villages. The verdicts decreed that the shooters had momentarily lost control of their free will, in both cases because the defense showcased the atrocities that had pushed each man to lose his composure rather than the murders they had committed. Polish-Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who later coined the term genocide in 1942, though it was only published in a book he wrote in 1944, mentioned both trials in the same breath. He referred to the absence, as he put it, of, quote, any law for the unification of moral standards in relation to the destruction of national, racial, and religious groups. Lemkin, for those of you who don't know, he lost all his family in the Holocaust. He eventually died in the U.S., penniless and at a very young age of heart failure. But he had coined the term genocide. He was sidelined at Nuremberg and never really he never got the recognition that he deserved during his lifetime. So he believed that Tellerian had acted as the self-appointed legal officer for the conscience of mankind. He called Schwarzbart's crime beautiful. Now, these are the first major trials in Western Europe featuring victims of interethnic violence at state-sponsored mass atrocities seeking justice. Lawyers used the trials to bring the Armenian Genocide and the Ukrainian pogroms into public view, even though it was the victims of these events who were on trial for murder. They took advantage of the media surrounding each trial, not only to call attention to the crimes, but also to highlight the absence of an international tribunal charged with bringing perpetrators to justice. Both trials took place at a particular moment: international imperialism, national self-determination, and claims about minority rights framed debates in the League of Nations about Armenian statehood. Jewish organizations pressured the League to protect Jews in the newly created nations of Eastern Europe. Now, both famously failed, both efforts. These two trials are also part of a broader phenomenon during and after the First World War of 1914 to 18 of using testimonial practices to denounce atrocities committed against suffering others. Jews and Armenians, in fact, produced volumes of photographs and narratives documenting the violence to which they had been subjected for a wide variety of audiences. Non-Armenians, such as the British historian Arnold Toynbee and the German missionary Johannes Lepsus, also wrote important works about the Armenian Genocide that documented and denounced the crimes. I'll talk about that a little later. The trials depended on victim testimony, whose use was controversial. Audiences equated atrocity literature with state propaganda, and publics believed that victims' perspectives were overly subjective. Toynbee and Lepsus had more credibility than eyewitnesses who were victims. Trials, however, provided a forum for publicizing atrocities in the defendant's words in court and to the press. I have mixed up something here. So Toynbee and Lepsus thus had more credibility than eyewitnesses who were victims. And this is a quotation from Toynbee's very famous book published in 1916 in the middle of the war, called Armenian Atrocities, The Murder of a Nation. So and he wrote, and I'll just read it, when we read that the Assyrian or Babylonian government carried into captivity such and such a broken people or tribe, we hardly seize the meaning of the statement. Even when we see the process portrayed with grim realism on the conqueror's bas-reliefs, it does not penetrate our imagination to the quick. But now we know. It has happened in our world, and the Assyrians' crime was not so fiendish as the Turks. Organized and effective massacre. That is what such a deportation means, and that must always have been its implication. So it is important to note that in the West, the Armenian Genocide really is the first one not to be publicly recognized, but to be recognized by important intellectuals, but also by the Russian government, who coined the term crimes against humanity in a diplomatic broadside. A broadside is not diplomatic by definition, but it was intended to be. It was a controversial document that did not make it into a treaty, but it was coined by the Russians to describe what happened to the Armenians. So the great powers, so in speaking about why victims' testimonies weren't believed, it's important to realize that Toynbee and others were in fact taking advantage purposefully and strategically of their role as prominent public intellectuals to speak on behalf of victims. Now, great powers also, the reason for the skepticism of victims is also because great powers had issued white papers describing the atrocities of others, the British on German conduct in Namibia, the Germans on the British in Kenya, not to mention apocryphal stories about enemies' actions during the Great War. So there was lots of atrocity literature out there, much of it, as I said, apocryphal. And much of it not, but competing national discourses about whether the British committed worse colonial crimes than the Germans. So the trials, however, provided a forum for publicizing atrocities in the defendant's words, in court and to the press. By putting the Armenian Genocide and the Jewish pogroms on trial, the lawyers hoped to prove that their clients had acted without premeditation, gripped by forces beyond their control. The more harrowing the testimony about defendants' suffering, the more likely they were to gain jurors' sympathies. Lawyers used temporary insanity defenses to argue that their client should be acquitted, defenses that were nonetheless a stretch given how much time had elapsed since the defendants witnessed the violence. Moreover, there was other evidence of premeditation in both cases. In the course of the trials, lawyers ended up subtly differentiating forms of organized violence, not only from combat and imperial conquest, but also from crimes against civilization, about which it was the obligation of the dismayed Western spectator to express horror. Until the word genocide was coined, these crimes were often referred to, and I'm sure you've heard these, or if not, they were referred to as horrors, vile acts of cowardice, unspeakable barbarism, and the like. In other words, this was a narrative of a so-called civilized spectator observing the violence elsewhere meaning other than the free democratic West. So I'm going to speak about the trial then of Tehlirian in detail now. Tehlirian's hasty 1921 trial lasted from June 2nd to June 3rd, 1921. During the preliminary investigative phase, he admitted he had killed Talat, but insisted that he had acted on his own. You'll recall that he was actually an operative in the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which had orchestrated the assassination. Worried about being condemned to death for a political murder, he played the role of an anguished and isolated actor whose epileptic fits, which he really suffered from, were brought on by memories of his family's murder. The prosecution never brought out his involvement in any organized plot to pursue Talat, who was the first of several Turkish nationalists to be assassinated in a series of murders the ARF, or Armenian Revolutionary Federation, dubbed Operation Nemesis. There are many books about this operation. Correspondence between the German Foreign Office and one of Tehlirian's defense lawyers indicates that the Weimar government, the German government in between the wars until Hitler took power in 1933, acted to limit and in one case prohibited the testimony of a diplomat at the trial in order not to expose the extent of German complicity. complicity in and knowledge of the Armenian Genocide. The Germans had acted essentially as a counterinsurgency force in Anatolia, where the genocide took place. Some killings took place in Istanbul as well of Armenian intellectuals. The Germans had acted, the Foreign Office may have hoped for a conviction in order not to alienate its former Turkish allies, but it was also concerned that the German army not be implicated in crimes against the Armenians. These government measures did not prevent the trial from becoming a cause célèbre, however, but shortened Talleyrand's time in the public eye and turned testimony away from the German army's misdeeds to the defendant's distress over what he said he witnessed, the murder of his mother and his brothers and the kidnapping of one of his sisters. Medical experts couldn't agree on whether he was responsible for his act, but they all agreed with one exception, that his epilepsy compromised his free will. What never came out in the trial was that Talleyrand did not witness the genocide, but was in Tiflis, now Tbilisi in Georgia, when the Turks murdered his family because he had volunteered to fight with the Russian army, but which many Armenians did during the Great War, even though Germany and Russia were enemies. When he returned home, he found a brother alive and the town abandoned. At the trial, he insisted that he had witnessed the murders. The trial, with its famous defense attorneys, who I'm not going to describe them all, became a media sensation. The judge's opening interrogation revealed his sympathy for the defendant, whom he probed gently about his experiences. Talleyrand recounted his story calmly and deliberately, beginning with the Ottoman order to leave his village in 1915, the robbery of their convoy by troops who stole their valuables. They had only been allowed to bring what they could carry. And then bursts of gunfire, at the sound of which a soldier dragged his sister away and his mother screamed, he said, "May I go blind?" Talleyrand said he could no longer bear to think about their suffering. "I do not want to be reminded of that day. It is better for me to die than describe the events of that black day." The judge urged him to try and recount what happened as best he could. Talleyrand described how his brother's head was split open with an axe, his mother was shot, and he woke up surrounded by corpses. His entire family had almost all disappeared without a trace. This actually happened, he just didn't witness it. In response to the judge's query about why he had initially admitted to having killed Talat, he replied, "When did I say that?" When pressed, he insisted that he had no plan to kill him and said instead, "I do not consider myself guilty because my conscience is clear. I have killed a man, but I am not a murderer," he claimed, acknowledging that about 2 weeks before the murder, he kept, quote, "seeing the scenes of the massacres over and over. I saw my mother's corpse. The corpse just stood up before me and said, 'You know Talat is here. You know he's here, and yet you do not seem to be concerned. You are no longer my son,' unquote. It was then that he decided to kill Talat, he said, but on further interrogation, he also claimed that he had made no such decision and did not even know Talat was in Berlin, and he appeared dazed and confused. This was obviously an act. The district attorney who prosecuted Talleyrand played it safe, referring to the massacres as killings known to us all and avoiding questions about Talat's relationship with the German army. He echoed the testimony of General Otto Liman von Sanders, head of the German military mission in the Ottoman Empire, who declared that the German army was shocked and surprised by the massacres. The general, who had been the object of British criticism for having abetted the murders, worked to counter charges of German complicity by insisting that all the officers up to the rank of general in the eastern provinces were Turks, and that, quote, "most of the perpetrators were not of a select class of soldiers. They were criminals or the perennially unemployed," unquote. He also claimed that the German government had protested Turkish violence against the Armenians. The prosecutor used von Liman's testimony to deflect from Talat's responsibility by portraying the murderers as rogue troops and the murders as an overheated but understandable response to Turkish fears of Armenian betrayal, that is, the fighting for Russia. Although von Liman's testimony defended the Germans, it also created sympathy for the defendant, for Talleyrand, who emerged as a victim of Turkish bloodthirstiness. The prominent defense attorney Johannes Werthauer also negated the real ties between Talat and Germany by calling to the stand an Armenian bishop who negated the real ties between Talat, by calling to the stand an Armenian bishop who had survived the genocide. He thanked the Germans for saving him. Testimonies also came from a wide range of eminent doctors, academics, military men, and Armenian witnesses who testified to their own experience with harrowing eyewitness reports. Christine Terzibashian from Anatolia described how wealthy Armenians were given advance notice that they were to leave their homes, while the poor were told to gather with little time to spare. 4 groups of 500 families from her village were evacuated. These are all, she is speaking about this. This is one of the first times these testimonies of the Armenian genocide were made public. As they filed out, she said, they began to walk over corpses from other villages. At some point, men were separated from the group, tied together, and thrown into the river, while those who remained were forced to watch. The presiding judge asked her, "How do you know that?" To which she responded, "I saw it with my own eyes." She went on to describe how Turkish gendarmes murdered the remaining men with axes, threw them in the river, and killed women whom they did not kidnap. When the judge asked, "Is all this really true? You're not imagining it?" He was trying to give her a platform. She swore that it was true, and even worse than she could relate. The judge then asked who was responsible, and she accused Talat Pasha, because the Turkish guards forced some of their victims to kneel and cry, "Long live the Pasha." Only 3 members of her family survived. Once evidence of the atrocities had been established and confirmed by credible authorities, Tellerian's lawyers sought to exculpate their client. Werthauer, careful not to cast aspersions on a former German ally, so as not to alienate the jury too much, acknowledged that Talat may have been a decent fellow, but called him a member of a, quote, militarist cabinet. And this is a fairly long quotation, but it's very important. A militarist, he said, and this is all quoting now, is a person opposed to justice. The militarist is not an individual who is a member of the military by calling. It is possible to be an officer or a soldier, wear a uniform, use weapons, and at the same time not be a militarist. The officer or soldier himself can uphold the principles of right and justice and perform his duties as a member of the military at the same time. On the other hand, there are countless militarists who have never put on a uniform. They sit at a desk, write articles, and fiercely defend the flag of brute force. The militarist, now that's the quotation, which is quite astonishing given that it's said in 1921. So he's distinguishing essentially soldiers' honor from a special caste of people. The militarists, he said, quote, annihilated the Armenians, unquote. They did not represent the Turkish people. They were not even soldiers. Here again, he made a crucial distinction between legitimate and illegitimate warriors. The militarists were, quote, well-trained animals that will never be able to have human feelings, unquote. They formed, he said, a distinctive new caste capable of deporting a whole nation. In contrast, Werthauer proclaimed, Tellerian was like the Swiss patriot Wilhelm Tell, who had killed a tyrant to save his people. By associating him with Tell, the defense associated the Shooter's Act with heroic, and he called it humanitarianism. And he, in so doing, displaced the German army's responsibility for murderous deeds onto Turks he cast as militarists. And he realigned German loyalties from the Ottoman Empire to the murdered Armenian nation. The prosecution tried but could not convict Tellerian. The trial cast him as an unconventional soldier whose murder of Talat was explained as a response to a militarist enemy. But how could his act be both heroic and driven by temporary insanity? According to the defense's logic, Tellerian was not a conventional hero because he could not have fought back under the circumstances. Rather, as the lawyers portrayed it, he was compelled by human conscience, by the necessity that right and justice must triumph no matter what, even at the expense of the Avengers' own life and freedom. The trial constituted a new kind of hero, battling a seemingly novel type of crime, Bureaucrats without uniforms signed writs decreeing the annihilation of a people. German conservative nationalists, not surprisingly, bemoaned Talleyrand's acquittal because it rewarded a man who had murdered a wartime German ally. Even the general public was uncomfortable, if sympathetic to the verdict, because Talleyrand had, after all, committed a cold-blooded murder. If the defense's lawyer's strategy, hardly convinced everyone, it accomplished its goal. An Armenian assassin on trial for murder turned the proceedings into a verdict on Armenian suffering and walked out of the courtroom a free man. And historians, to the extent they've written about this trial, which is really only German historians who write about Armenian genocide denial, have argued that this trial was the turning point in which German conservative nationalists turned from denying the genocide to actually saying, yes, it existed, but so what? Right? That this trial made them need to confront the genocide and force the public to recognize that it had existed and that the Germans probably had been complicit in it. Now I'll turn to the trial of Schweitzbart. So the Schweitzbart case drew many comparisons to Talleyrand's. None was more powerful, in fact, than Schweitzbart's defense attorney's proclamation that an Armenian named Talleyrand, like his client Schweitzbart, had cried, "I am pleased to have done what I did. I've avenged my people. I've killed a butcher." That Talleyrand had made no such declaration is beside the point. He actually raised this case in Schweitzbart's trial. Torres insisted that, like Talleyrand, Schweitzbart must also be declared not guilty. Audiences understood both trials to be about the inhumane treatment of a minority population with no recourse to the usual tribunals of justice. Schweitzbart's trial highlighted in a public forum the routinized violence to which Ukrainian Jews had long been subjected. As in Talleyrand's case, the trial revolved less around Schweitzbart's deed than around the atrocities committed in pogroms and whether the army leader Shimon Petlura had really organized and sanctioned them. The state brought the case against Schweitzbart on behalf of Petlura's widow and brother. The lawyers were seasoned and very famous. When the judge interrogated Schweitzbart at the beginning of the trial, the defendant was defiant and headstrong. Since the prosecution insisted that he was part of a Soviet conspiracy, the judge asked if he had really acted alone. He insisted he had and explained his motive by focusing on the horror of the Ukrainian pogroms. He claimed that a non-Jewish Russian acquaintance in Paris had told him about having overheard officers from the White Russian Army, that is the anti-Bolshevik section of the Russian army, talking about their exploits in a hospital waiting room. One claimed that he had raped 37 Jewish women, and the other boasted that he had killed 15 Jews in a single day. The acquaintance told Schweitzbart that he was so shaken by the terrible stories that he left without finishing his medical treatment. Schweitzbart told the judge, "You can imagine the state that I was in. I was present at pogroms. I saw atrocities committed, and I forced myself to forget them. But the Russians who came to tell me these things awakened in me all these memories, and that had a huge impact on me." The judge, as was customary, in order to establish the facts of the case, proceeded to describe how Schweitzbart located Petlura in Paris and how he had been killed. At one point, the judge asked, quote, "You wanted to avenge your co-religionists who were victims of pogroms in the Ukraine, pogroms organized, according to you, by Petlura." When Schweitzbart once again replied yes, the judge asked him why he believed that Petlura was responsible for the pogroms. Schweitzbart offered a short history lesson. He was prone to grandstanding. Petlura took Ukraine by force against the Bolsheviks, and the first thing his men did, he said, was to massacre Jews. Calling Petlura's men true brutes, he stated that they surprised people in their homes as they slept, quote, because they knew that the Jewish population had no defense. They shamed women in front of their husbands, daughters in front of their fathers and brothers. They burned and pillaged. They planned pogroms. Pogroms are assassinations, pillage, and rape. Voila, the pogrom. He then claimed that Petlura's soldiers had a slogan on their armbands and hats, quote, "Kill the Jews and save Ukraine," unquote. Other witness testimony bore out Schweitzbart's claims, not only about the atrocities committed in pogroms, but also about Petlura's responsibility. The prosecutor asked pioneering Jewish historian from Kiev, Elias Churikauer, if Petlura was at least partially responsible for the pogroms. He responded that no one in Ukraine doubted his responsibility and recounted the Jewish community's multiple pleas with Petlura to stop the pogroms to no avail. Quote, "The assurances Petlura gave about his opposition to pogroms can be compared to calling the doctor after the sick person dies, or to calling the fireman after the fire has already been snuffed out." And now I'll talk about some of the victim testimonies in the trial for a little bit, conclude about both trials, and then try to give you a few points of reference so that to give you a sense of what one can draw from these trials, I think, about the creation of the cultural meaning of genocide. So the witness, Mademoiselle Grimberg, as she was called, her name was Haya Greenberg, a medical student, testified about a particularly brutal pogrom in 1919. She said that she left her office one evening only to hear savage cries as Ukrainian soldiers approached the Jewish parts of the city. The next afternoon, she went to care for the wounded and found there had been a massacre. The survivors had lost entire families, including young children, all murdered by soldiers wielding bayonets. A young woman of 19 who witnessed her mother's murder saw the Ukrainians throw themselves on her and cry, quote, "This is for our father, Petlura," unquote. Greenberg's grandparents' home had been turned into a hospital. There, she, as a medical student, cared for more wounded children, their mothers, and later a woman with a bullet lodged in her throat who died in Greenberg's arms. She spoke about all of this. Many of them perished, had limbs amputated, or were struck dumb by terror. She claimed that some of Petlura's soldiers stopped by the makeshift hospital to express their shame at the senseless murders while others sang and played music in the streets. She testified that the Jewish council of the town, of which her father was a member, went to plead with Petlura to leave them in peace, but he did nothing to stop the pogroms or punish his men. She did not know of an order by Petlura and did not see him herself, but insisted that he was responsible for the atrocities. The prosecution called witnesses to prove that claims about Petlura's responsibility were exaggerated or false. These were men who had served in the military with Petlura and civilians who testified to his great affection for the Jewish people. The prosecution set the stage by arguing that in Ukraine and Russia, pogroms were simply a fact of life, and Jews among their many victims. They underlined the chaos of the period during which Germans fought with Ukrainians against the Bolsheviks, and the Ukrainians were split into many groups, some of whom fought with Petlura for Ukrainian independence. In this environment, in which troops of various loyalties battled ferociously, the prosecution witnesses claimed that the Bolsheviks also engaged in pogroms, as did rogue elements of an otherwise honorable Ukrainian military. You can see the similarities between the two stories. A Ukrainian ex-military man proclaimed that he had personally struggled both to prevent the Jewish colonization of Ukraine and to stop the Bolsheviks from creating a Jewish republic. In one of the most dramatic moments of the trial, a former army colonel denied Petlura's responsibility for any massacres. He stated that he couldn't be responsible because the pogroms against Jews were the work of, quote, divinely inspired revenge, unquote. In other words, these witnesses had not been coached. And so they sort of alienated the jury by these sentiments. Torres, of course, the defense attorney for Schweitzbart, made hay of these statements, mocking the reference to divinely inspired revenge and skillfully weaving a narrative about the pogroms into his cross-examinations. He insisted that Petlura had not punished one of his officers until a year and a half after the worst pogrom, underlining testimony that the action demonstrated Petlura's compassion for Jews. When asked if his witness, Haya Greenberg, had not simply relied on public rumors about who was responsible for the pogroms, Torres argued that the violence, or the defense attorney argued the violence was systemic and organized, and in a dig against the rogue troop argument, reminded the court about Greenberg's claim that Petlura's soldiers had cried, "This is for our dear father Petlura." And this is very similar, obviously, to the Turkish gendarmes who forced their victims to thank the Pasha. His point was that even if Petlura did not participate in deadly pogroms, the murderers invoked his name and presumed his approbation. Torres also deftly compared the civilized values of the French command to the barbarism of Ukrainian troops, turning the rogue troop claim into a characterization of Ukrainian brutality rather than an assertion about a few groups of hooligans. In France, he argued, military promotions were based on merit, while in the Ukraine, army titles were given away as spoils of war. He implied that since the officers testifying likely did what they were told in order to reap rewards, it was hard to imagine that Petlura was ignorant of what his men were doing. Of course, this is using, it's within the narrative of the civilizing mission, and I'm going to talk about that. Torres put to rest any questions about Schweitzbart's character by reference to his time as a French soldier. He argued that Schweitzbart had absorbed French honor on the battlefield, refused the passivity of his ancestral race, and demanded justice. Though Schweitzbart, like Talleyrand, was a vigilante, in fact, the assassination was treated as a crime of passion, the legal category usually used to acquit enraged husbands or wives who murdered their adulterous spouses. Like Talleyrand, his actions were driven by an insatiable passion for justice, as the court reasoned. He had fought back against an army who preyed not upon patriotic enemies, but defenseless civilians, and was dedicated to slaughtering his people, whom both sought to avenge. So in conclusion, what do we make about all this? Let me just summarize the two cases and then get to the final points. Talleyrand and Schweitzbart restored honor, provided a legal resolution in court to shocking crimes for which no one could be held accountable. Lawyers made the suffering witness on the stand the protagonists of the stories rather than the villains. The source of Talleyrand and Schweitzbart's conscience, and hence their humanitarian war on barbarism, was not the courage of the traditional hero. Their acts originated in an injury inflicted by their subjection to powerful memories of violence that overtook their lives. Even if they had already endured the worst, their psychological wounds caused such extreme disorientation that under certain circumstances they might not be in their right mind when they pulled the trigger. The trial narratives pitted these injured men against their enemies. In these stories, Talleyrand and Schweitzbart, disoriented by suffering, confronted the men they killed, while the Turkish militarists and the Ukrainians had low-level troops who did their dirty work. The Armenian and Jewish Avengers had pure humanitarian motives, while the militarists committed calculated, organized crimes of annihilation, or, like the Ukrainians, perpetrated systematic mass atrocities motivated by animus and cruelty. This is obviously a discourse of honor. The righteous avenger's persecution is a wound he can no longer bear. He strikes out to staunch the bleeding. He is a survivor not of war between nations, but, as Raphael Lemkin noted, of national attacks on stateless groups, and embodies the traumatic effects of injuries left by the experience of mass victimization for which there was no remedy other than the avenger's own action. The trials imagine, and there are many other trials like this, a new kind of crime and formed a novel, victim-centered concept of a witness who demands not pity or empathy, but justice. This is very rare. This is completely new. I have to emphasize that, though it may not seem to you, it is completely new. So to conclude, there are 3 points that will bring us back to our understanding of the cultural meaning attributed to genocide. 1, the violence perpetrated against Jews and Armenians is not represented as violence typical of human nature at war or in conquest. Instead, it articulates a new kind of crime perpetrated by a new kind of criminal in which millions of people die because they belong to an ethnic or religious group rather than because they pose a threat to state power. The criminal's violence is not only described as the regrettable barbarism that ostensibly goes along with imperial conquest and war. It is calculated, deliberate, and all the more violent for all that. I'll get to why these illustrations are. The victim's survival and witness are forms of heroism. This is a concept of heroism radically different from from conventional models of Western tragic heroes who die nobly, especially in battle. Both defendants, Tellerian and Schweitzbart, were celebrated at the time because they were perceived to have fought back, though only because lawyers jumped through rhetorical hoops and transformed them into righteous Avengers. Later, victims would not have to have fought back to prove their innocence or heroism. They merely had to survive. This portrait of survival, much later after the 1970s, became crucial in explaining why people subject to mass murder could not resist their persecutors, especially regarding European Jews who were murdered in Hitler's genocide. By the 1990s, survival itself became a form of resistance and bearing witness a new weapon of the powerless. 3, finally, in these trials, we already see emerging the idea of a survivor who experiences a deep bond with those who perish and needs to recount their suffering to the world, not only in honor of their memory, but to assuage guilt and anxiety for having lived. This is the classic definition of a traumatized person now in Western psychiatry, that is the standard diagnosis of survivors of mass violence. Of course, other forms of mass violence are deliberate and strategic, imperial conquest and war, both. Wars are not necessarily, as we know, fought for noble causes. My point here is that for the first time in the West, interethnic and religious violence outside of an ostensibly free democratic West was not conceived as natural and regrettable, but understood to be a specific kind of violation of humanity. I should say that both Tellerian and Schweitzbart were figured in the trials, I didn't have time to address this, as Easterners. They were called by all kinds of racist stereotypes constantly, and I quoted a few of them, but the narrative was that they were clearly foreign, and they had to be brought in under the mantle of Western civilization. These trials begin to make an argument, however unwittingly and through the prism of the civilizing mission, that violence of this sort was not only a sign of group infighting for dominance, of conquest taking its toll on the innocent, of unconstrained human nature. In order to acquit victims of such crimes who had avenged the perpetrators, lawyers were forced to make arguments explaining why the violence did not fit a conventional script, that it was planned and deliberate collective murder rather than a byproduct of conquest, which of course was considered to be legitimate, that it was not perpetrated by rogue actors, but by leaders who were responsible, that it targeted specific groups who posed no threat other than their ethnic difference. Victims were utterly innocent and could not die heroic deaths. Their miraculous survival was noble rather than to be pitied, and bearing witness was their reason for living. This concept of witness as a form of political morality would be developed more fully, as I mentioned, after 1970 in the wake of the genocide of European Jewry, and then applied retroactively to victims of colonial violence. And here, I'll show something. Let me go here. If you look, this is just a Google Ngram, but if you look at genocide, obviously, it's coined in 1940. You see there's a slight thickening of the line around 1920. That's because of the Armenian Genocide, which makes no sense since the word genocide actually had not been coined yet. So this is just a Google problem, or people using the term anachronistically. So you can see what happens is that in 1940, it begins to gain some traction, but very, very little. And then by 1961 is the date of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, in which the SS commander, Nazi Adolf Eichmann, is convicted. And look at what happens by the year 2000, it's everywhere. So it actually takes quite a long time to become a rather conventional way of talking about mass murder, and it's rarely used as a legal category for reasons of great power conflict. So that's interesting. And then I wanted to, I think here. Whoops. Okay, so, and you can see what's happened since the 1990s, especially as with the war against the bombing of Belgrade, and then the Rwandan Genocide in 1994, You see this, these are whole book series, Witness to Genocide. These are indigenous peoples in Guatemala. This is obviously in northern Iraq. And this is a whole series, Bearing Witness. And you can see all of this is being conflated or called genocide. And you see the Bosnian situation, that you can't see the whole thing. It's being called ethnic cleansing, though the series is called Genocide and Ethnic Cleansing because the differences are very hard to define. And there are books written about what the differences are, none of which are wholly convincing. And so part of my effort here is to say, well, how did we start thinking about genocide as a particular form of violence in the first place? Okay, so I mentioned that these bearing witness, as you can see, is retroactively applied to victims of colonial violence. Now, most ironic, and this is something I do in the end of the book, and I couldn't address it here, but I'll just finish on this note. Most ironic is that just as imperial genocides have been called by their names, genocide has become a seemingly permanent part of our geopolitical landscape, and the vast majority of perpetrators now brought before the International Criminal Court, which only started working in 2002 as an independent court, hail from the global south. The recognition of genocide may have been part of a Western self-reckoning, which it was after the Second World War, but it now appears to have become part of a new script decrying horrors elsewhere. We may be back to the beginning, in which the deliberate violence of post-imperial wars is waged once again in the name of civilization, now termed humanity, cast in the image of a free and democratic West. Thank you. Do you have questions? Or? Oh, you don't have a question?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought.
So we just heard a fascinating lecture. The floor is open. Professor Jean will take questions. So please feel free to ask questions. Please keep your questions short and to the point. Please identify yourself briefly before.
Yes, my name is Sajid Ali, and I would like to say that as we have come to the conclusion that genocide is not an ancient problem which was there at the time of Moses and in Egypt, but it has come down all the way to the modern times also. As you say, in Canada, the First Nations, there was agricultural genocide. Now they don't know their identity. Those people who first migrated to Canada, who first went to Canada. So what more do you want to say about this? I'm interested in this topic.
Of indigenous peoples, or I'm not...
Also them, yes. Sorry.
The question is the identity of the immigrants to Canada?
Also the immigrants, they also lost their identity, and the people who were there, Indians, the Red Indians, in fact, yes.
You mean how are they victims of genocide, or how is that defined more or less?
Would you describe that as a genocide?
Cultural genocide.
The Native Americans and...
Yes.
Yeah, most of this, at least I'm not an expert on, obviously, on the genocide of indigenous peoples. There are people in this room, I'm sure, who are far more expert. But certainly the people who are expert describe, now the word is settler colonialism, which means empires that settle in various places and annihilate it in various ways the indigenous peoples who live there. And that would be true of the indigenous peoples of what is now called Canada, as well as the United States, and in Latin America, what we now call Latin America as well. And Australia, Tasmania, the entire area of the British Empire, not all parts of it. And there's a lot of controversy about that definition, but that is it's used in all kinds of places. There's even a lot of controversy about who is indigenous. I think it's pretty clear in the case of the modern United States, Canada, and other areas. It's less clear in other areas of the world, but what indigenous means has become a legally very important term, because it means you are native to the land. And so legally, to make claims based on your relationship to the land is a crucial legal category, indigeneity, is very, very important. So my understanding is that this is why it's a subject of much discussion and debate. I don't know if that satisfies you, but.
Good evening, Anthony Kashtorian. I'm one of the few Armenians here, and my family a long time ago were from this region of Turkey, but we left before any of this happened. We moved off to Persia, and then via there came to India. What I wanted to ask you is, I'm one of the black sheep in the community. I'm not entirely convinced that the Turks targeted us because we are Armenians. I'm of the view that if that community there happened to be Hindus who joined the Russians against the Germans, or Muslims who joined the Russians against the Germans, the Turks would have wiped them out too. Unlike what Hitler did to the Jews, which was very specific, very targeted and unambiguous, there's no doubt there. Do you think I'm wrong in that? Do you think they were specifically targeted for being Armenians? Or do you think they were targeted because they had taken the wrong side in this war?
Well, that's a very difficult question, and as you know very well, there are many sides to this, and we can't. Obviously, the Turkish government puts restrictions on the kind of research one can do in the archives. So there are people who have been able to research this topic, but we still don't know everything that might be there. What's most exciting is the German government opened its foreign correspondence, so we can see more than we ever have been able to before, so we know what the German responsibility for the genocide. I guess the way I would answer is as a historian and say that the Armenians were there. In other words, they were the people that were murdered, and there were many reasons for that. They were, as you know, Christian. They were, some were allied with the Russians, but others were living in villages. They were not fighting with the Russians. They may have had sympathies that way. I think it's very hard to argue that the Armenians were an actual threat to the Turkish Republic, the burgeoning Turkish Republic, and the Turkish nationalists. The historians' arguments now, let me just summarize it that way, since my own opinion is not very important, but which is that the history of genocide has now been, how can I put this? Rather than being seen as centered on the Holocaust of European Jewry, it's obviously been expanded, but also the history of genocide has been seen as originating now in the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the Russian Empire. So that in the dissolution of these empires and the rise of extreme nationalism, you see for the first time outside of an imperial context, huge population transfers, expulsions, and murder. And so many historians would argue that the Armenian Genocide is part of this general development, this global, what we could see as a more global development. So I guess the idea that there would be any group as a historian, would be hard to argue, because historians have to say, well, who was there? Why did this happen? So whether the evidence is there for Armenian betrayal, it was certainly used rhetorically to legitimate the genocide after the fact. Certainly it's hard, the assassination of, the roundup and assassination of prominent Armenians in Istanbul and their murder is hard to explain that way. But certainly, in particular, all the little villages in Anatolia were no threat to Turkish nationalism. And so if you just define it in that way, it's really hard to legitimate or justify. In fact, that is what the German conservative nationalists argued, right? That even in this trial, it was very complicated. I don't know if that answers your question. I would contextualize it very differently than you have, that's all.
Good evening, I am Sumit. I am basically a lawyer. So I want to mention with respect to the context with respect to India. So almost all of you are aware of the anti-Sikh pogrom which happened in India in 1984, aftermath the death of the assassination of Indira Gandhi. So the Delhi High Court a few months back, it recognized the 1984 anti-Sikh pogrom as a genocide. Probably the first time it happened that a constitutional court recognizing it, although India ratifying the Genocide Convention doesn't have a law to define what is genocide and the punishment for that. Now, contrary to that, I want to mention that the Indian Supreme Court, the highest constitutional court in India, it had taken contrary decisions on two aspects. One was with respect to the reinvestigation of the closed cases with respect to the 1984 Sikh riots, and where it ordered the reinvestigation into more than 200 cases that were closed by the police because the so-called political party was in power. However, the same Supreme Court, one of the judge of that was the judge in the other case. There was a petition filed by a Kashmiri Pandit organization called Roots in Kashmir. They also wanted reinvestigation into cases, around 215 cases that were closed by the government. And so they cited also the video evidences also where the former terrorists or the militants, they were admitting that they committed so and so crimes. So the thing is, whereas one high court, which is a lower court recognizing in genocide, whereas the highest court of the land, it is not recognizing, it is taking different approaches, although one, at least one of the judges being same in the thing. So what do you say about this?
I guess that's a level of detail that you clearly are very knowledgeable. I guess what I would say is that defining whether genocide is genocide legally and how it's done is a political problem, of course, a political question, and not a conceptual question always. And that's only what historians work on. I guess what I would say then is that what this suggests, your story suggests that there's not going to be international recognition for some genocides, right? And that it takes a lot of political work and legal work for a genocide of any sort to be recognized because of the obligations that the political and even military, as problematic as that is, obligations and moral obligations that ostensibly come with the naming of a particular set of crimes or a crime as a genocide. And so in this case, to have claimed a genocide, first of all, it's, in India it's very complex, right? It even is complex abroad. If you witness the Canadian-Indian situation that Trudeau brought about by meeting the representative of the Sikhs. So I think that it tells you that what the interesting questions for a historian would be why is this happening now? You could come up with a lot of answers. What are the legal? How is the legal apparatus allowing it at this moment? What is the tension between the lower courts and the high court? Obviously, this is a very complicated question. And how are other communities responding to this? This is clearly a problem also of cultural memory, right? And genocide is not as universal as it's supposed to be. It's very complicated. What is a genocide? I'm not sure the legal definition is so vague as to be really hard to enforce or to make sense of. And so the last thing I'll say is that there's a reason we have a cultural meaning attributed to it so that it becomes recognizable. Because politically, most state actors would not recognize genocide. I mean, it's very well known that the Genocide Convention was essentially toothless. It was passed in 1948, and it's toothless precisely because there was absolutely no will on the part of any sovereign power, sovereign state, to interfere in the affairs of another. And this is particularly true of the imperial powers, right? Because the British wrote memos, alarm memos, when there was going to be an investigation into crimes in Tunisia by an NGO in the 50s, saying no, we can't allow this regime to be criticized, or else we'll be criticized. Right? This is very common. So this is why it took as you must know, it took until 2002 for an international court to be operative. And the United States is not a signatory for obvious reasons, because they would always be in the dock. So it's a real problem.
You spoke about genocide. Now there's also the politics of apology that has slowly started to take shape across the globe. So what is the history of apology now? In a brief history, especially with Armenia, it came up when I think Barack Obama had, I think Barack Obama didn't refer to it as genocide when he went to Turkey. So what is the politics of apology?
Oh, that's a very, very difficult question, actually, because on the one hand, I don't know how people would feel. On the one hand, it seems apology is crucial because it's about recognition. And recognition is the first step to anything, right? To any kind of political action. The problem, of course, is that already, and this is on the right and the left both, so it's across the political spectrum, the politics of apology has been interpreted as a merely cynical, empty exercise. That is, there can be apologies to some peoples, but the Turks are NATO allies, therefore we don't apologize, right? The French government was fairly brave simply by calling the genocide a genocide. So I guess one of the things, I don't have very much interesting to say, I don't think, but I think what I could say is that I find both the idea that apology is necessary very compelling, because for an empire, for representatives of a former empire to recognize that they actually committed crimes still today is absolutely crucial. Now, one can also think it's sort of silly. I mean, Macron, the Prime Minister of France, the President of France, I'm sorry, he acknowledged that the Algerian war, that French soldiers committed torture. But he apologized on behalf of a French activist who was against colonial crimes. He didn't apologize on behalf of the French government to Algerians. So that is the kind of thing I think that feeds the cynicism that these apologies are almost always cynical political, are often, I shouldn't say always, are often cynical political strategies. And so for the people especially now in post-colony, in post-colonial states, they don't need apologies, I suspect, anymore. Though it may make people in other kinds of contexts feel themselves. I am not sure for who the audience for Macron, the Prime Minister, the President of France, I don't know why I insist on making him Prime Minister, the President of France's declaration was clearly for a domestic audience, not Algerians, or it certainly would fall on deaf ears, I would imagine. So I guess right now one could argue that the politics of apology really has become a cynical political exercise, while trying to hold on to the fact that apology as a form of recognition is extremely important, and like anything can be used instrumentally, but that we shouldn't, especially from the British, I suspect, because I'm not a British historian, so I shouldn't. But it's interesting because I can imagine a debate here when and if that should happen, because it will make all the people go nuts in Britain. I mean, they're dealing with another self-inflicted wound at the moment, but to do this would be called a political distraction, perhaps, if it actually happened in the next 10 days. But it also would. You can imagine a debate between people who thought it was necessary and important for reasons of recognition, finally, right? Too late, but maybe not too little. And yet you can also imagine people making the argument that this is cynical, that this is, and I'm sure this would be debated here quite a lot. What was the motivation of Cobb? What was Cobb's motivation? Just to push?
You mean of Jallianwala Bagh? It was just, it was a peaceful gathering, I think.
This happened in 1919 because the British had, in the context of the First World War, and the sort of agitations, peaceful agitations in different parts of India for more rights, not self-determination. So the British had actually promulgated a sort of censorship, an ordinance called the Raoult Act, which were very acts of control. And there was a gathering in Amritsar, in this place called Jallianwala Bagh, which was a peaceful agitation, and a British military general named Michael O'Dwyer, he just ordered firing, indiscriminate firing on a peacefully agitating crowd, after locking the gate, yes. Yes, so that, and so that became one of the symbolic acts of the British atrocities. But surprisingly, the British actually hailed General O'Dwyer as a hero. He was put on trial, and the British actually raised money to defend him in his trial. So that is, this year is the centenary. And one of India's parliamentarians named Shashi Tharoor has actually demanded that the British acknowledge their guilt by symbolically apologizing to the Indian public and paying reparations for 200 years of imperial rule by paying a reparation of 1 rupee.
You know, the 1 rupee is a genius, rhetorical genius. I mean,
Yes.
that's really very, that's the very
Exactly.
clever part.
I had a question, Carolyn. I thought, you were talking about a time, 1920s down to 1940s is of course the decade when the term genocide first gets coined. But this is also a period when you have concepts of a just war, because the wars of the 1890s, the previous wars, the carving of Africa, Sino-Japanese War, Russo-Japanese War, the Boer War, they were all straightforward imperialist wars. And there is nothing that goes on in the colonized parts of the world that gets termed as even a crime against humanity. Belgian atrocities in Congo, Mark Twain writes this book called King Leopold's Soliloquy, but people don't recognize that as mass atrocities. So, but in 1914, you have a just war because it's a war waged to make the world safe for democracy. You have the question of fixing of responsibility for the war, reparations on Germany. There is a question of justice and redemption going on at this time. And then you have these instances of a just killing, of a just murder, in a sense, because they were really murdering people who were mass murderers in their own right. But in the trials, and you said that they were not really straightforward heroes, because if they were, it would be very simple, because justice is very simple. It's like what we see in the Marvel comics, the justice in the Avengers in Marvel comics. But this is complicated because they are things like they are like damaged goods. Like they are people who are temporarily out of their minds, and therefore they are driven to make these murders. And so why, in a situation in which we talk a lot about just war and just killing, why are these people not straightforward heroes? It makes sense from a legal point of view to plead temporary insanity, but how does this gel with the perspective taken by the witnesses themselves or the communities themselves who are the victims? Why doesn't it fit?
Oh, it actually, these are for the public. So the Armenian community, on the one hand, I don't know if Telyyan was a hero for, say, prior generations in your family, for example, but he was a hero for the Armenians, obviously, and the same thing with the Jew. There is it's in Israel, apparently, there is you see this, the Avengers Street is a street in Beersheba, and it clearly he was recognized, and Hannah Arendt wrote about these trials without saying very much, but she criticized the Eichmann trial by saying that these guys were the real deal because they actually took the risk into their own hands of their own lives and their own freedom. She doesn't put it that way. And the Israelis, when they kidnapped Eichmann, she said, didn't do that because nobody had to risk anything to kidnap him. It was so, without getting into Hannah Arendt's argument, obviously, but she says nothing more about them. And if you go back to the trials, then what you find is a lot of information about the community response and a lot of anxiety on both sides about how. So Telyyan is arrested, and he gets very nervous because he doesn't know. The idea was never for the fact that he was an assassin to come out, right? Because the whole point was to kill these Turkish architects of genocide. It was not to be caught. And so when he was caught, it was crucial that they decided to stage it as a recognition of the genocide, so to bring it to a world. And what I didn't talk about here and I deal with in the book is the press coverage of both. And it was all aimed at making Western publics, in one case a French, in another case a German, but this was covered in papers in the United States, in Britain, etc. These cases were covered extensively, and the way they were covered was, wincing at the verdicts, because after all, you're letting murderers go free. And on the other hand, how can you not? I mean, given the sufferings that were detailed in court, suddenly the Armenian Genocide becomes a real thing that people experience. And it again, these trials in particular do not break the mold, and that's, again, like all the details of the civilizing mission. By that I mean that the prism through which these guys are seen, as you can imagine from some of the things I said, are, the ancestral race of the passive Jew. Because he spends time in the French army, he can no longer stand the passivity with which Jews have normally approached their enemies. The Armenian guy that basically, plays he becomes very passive on the stand. He sort of plays that he's disoriented, that he has this whole story about his mother. Now, he was traumatized. I mean, his family was murdered. Nonetheless, this is all a lot of orchestration on the part of Jews in Paris, for example, were very worried that the trial was going to increase anti-Semitism. And of course, what the reason he won is primarily because of the anti-Semitism of the Russians who went on trial and who said that the pogroms were divinely inspired vengeance. So this shocked juries. So I think that basically you were dealing with a presumed public sentiment that violence wasn't so good. These people were not going to be heroes in the way Lemkin said Schwarzbart's crime was beautiful, right? That was why I included him, because he says it's beautiful, and he says Talleyrand was acting as the conscience of mankind. Now those are victim communities that understand. I don't mean to say they're victims. I just mean they are communities that identify with victims. So of course they're heroes to these communities. But how do you represent these crimes to a general public who allied with the Turks during the war, who have to deal with questions of German complicity in a genocide? And the lawyers very, very carefully do not try to steer the trial away from German complicity and make the avenger noble. And in the process, they have to turn him into an avenger that is somehow, whose vengeance becomes acceptable. And that's really what's so difficult about these trials, is not to just make them, they're already morally very complex, but, so these are smart lawyers, essentially. Does that make sense? I don't know if, yeah.
Yes, okay, so we will have a last question. Please make it brief.
Since you refer to the Schweitzbart Convention, there was some incident in 2004. Azerbaijani lieutenant, he was convicted of murdering his counterpart from Armenia, and that the convict was sent in Budapest, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment by the Hungarian court. Because of this Schweitzbart Convention, he was extradited to Azerbaijan, and despite all assurances given, which the Azerbaijani government gave to Hungarian government, he was given a hero's welcome, he was pardoned, and he was promoted to the rank of major. And he was given 8 years back wages with an apartment in Baku.
Sorry.
So that happened not in the last decade only.
Right, so that's a comment, right? Yeah.
Are you surprised?
It happened during a NATO training program in Budapest in 2004, I suppose.
Okay, so we have listened to a fascinating talk, which has put us out of our comfort zones and full of insights.
Right.
And thank you so much for taking such time to answer all these questions. So Please join me in thanking Professor Carolyn J.